So I've been grinding out season one and really enjoying the rogue, actually having quite a bit of fun. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the state of rogue for season one. Now, before I say anything, this isn't a critique or, oh no, rogue is trash or anything like that. In fact, I think the rogue is the best speed clearer in the game. Falls off a little bit as per usual when we talk about very end game pushing, but still is solid. But maybe like third compared to some other classes. That's kind of where I think the rogue is at the current moment. And that's exactly kind of where I expected them to be. So, really, rogue is a definitely good class to play. However, the ironic part about season one is it did exactly the opposite of what the developers' so-called vision is for the game, and that's what I really want to talk about. Now, I've been trying out a couple different builds, and I've showcased some with like no basic, going back to the trapper option with a little bit of poison imbuement in there. But one thing's super certain, and that is that there's a very, very big focus within the rogue skills in general on a melee focused build. Let me give you a few examples. Now, they recently went ahead and nerfed siphoning strikes, but siphoning strikes literally does not work unless you're close to your enemies. And since siphoning strikes is basically the only nerf that we've gotten on the rogue along with the twisting blades, you can already start to see that when you have a close damaging build or melee build, well, that's going to be generally stronger than your ranged options, unless you're playing your ranged options in melee form. Look at this, close damage reduction. There is no distant damage reduction within the rogue's kit, okay? You go even further, and a lot of the options, like for example, the other damage reduction options, really have to do with damage over time and control impairing effects, which don't really work out. Then you consider their mobility skills. Well, guess what? Shadow Step literally puts you in front of the air, rather behind the enemy. Dash, obviously, dashes you towards the enemy, or potentially away, but typically you're going to be going through because you want, if you're going to go for the additional upgrades, to actually hit enemies with that dash. Heck, you could even look at things like potentially the concussive options with trick attacks and the rapid gambits, and you can find that oftentimes the way to knock down opponents is through like the trapper skills and such, which generally require you to be melee or to kite your opponents into them, which takes a lot more time. Go even further into all sorts of different things, like the traps being placed on you, meaning that you kind of need to be in the middle of everyone in order for it to work. There's so many other things that I can talk about. Puncture being the strongest basic, but you need to be at least mid-range to hit all three blades, or at least two of them, etc. But this actually goes even further, because one thing that Blizzard has actually done, let's say you wanted to play a range build. Okay, well, a lot of the rogue passives and things don't work with it, and it's generally perceived as weaker unless you're playing like rapid fire in melee range, which some people don't want to do. But then, and to be honest, this kind of applies to every class, and that is the barber. However, I would say for the rogue, it's actually particularly awkward, more so than some other classes. Now, I haven't dove into every class and compared it with the barber, but the barber has very unique text. First off, though, why are we even considering this? Well, the barber is ending up to be the most powerful component to a vast majority of the builds. Now, I've shown and tried to use builds without the barber. However, I've found that they're just weaker, which kind of sucks. And so the barber here is kind of crucial to your builds. But what the barber does, for those of you that don't know, is that it stores your damage. And so anything, and I'll give you a couple of examples here, that says when you deal damage, deal direct damage, things like that, they do not actually go ahead and proc their certain basically affixes or whatever they're trying to proc. For example, fundamental puncture, if you crit with this, well, guess what? We go ahead and store the damage, and we're not going to be applying vulnerable. Siphoning strikes, when we go ahead and critically strike a close enemy, we're going to go ahead and heal. Well, if you wanted to use siphoning strikes, which is quite a bit worse now, well, you got to wait for it to be exploded or the damage to be released in order for you to actually even get any benefit from this. Okay, well, what about some other things? Well, things like the exposure, which is I'm going to be removing this soon, doesn't actually go ahead and work with the barber because dealing direct damage again gets stored and you have to wait for it to explode, and therefore dealing damage with trap skills or to an enemy with affected by a trap skill is a lot harder. And this applies to so many different areas of the build. You can say death trap. You could consider even poison imbuement. Poison imbuement doesn't actually work with the barber, so you have to use it separately, and it's still decent if you want to do so. But because of imbuing it and some awkward interactions, based on what I've seen, the poison imbuement doesn't actually work with the barber. And so there's so many different situations where, well, your build limitations are skyrocketing with season 1 because we've basically been locked out. I should say locked out, but heavily discouraged from going for certain options because they are just worse due to the interactions with that heart. And I'm sure this applies to a lot of other classes. In fact, I think basically every class in the game is going to want to run the barber. And so you could say, oh, well, every class has these restrictions. And you might be right. And maybe this video should be the state of season 1, the barber edition, because that really is kind of taking over the game at this point. But I think it's kind of funny because they mention that their design philosophy is trying to bring up other builds to parity. What ends up happening is the melee builds end up getting a little bit stronger, in my opinion, from the barber, because when you're playing melee, all the enemies get grouped up unless you have some other grouping option, which the rogue doesn't really have at a ranged position. And so guess what? The barber is going to be more effective in melee. So again, it kind of encourages you to use melee builds and discourages you to use ranged builds, or at least the sniper position. You can use ranged skills in melee form, but again, that's kind of a little bit awkward. And so a lot of the other builds that might have been interesting for some other people are kind of knocked out of the way. And this, again, I'm sure applies to other classes, and maybe this is just a look at the barber and perhaps needs to be changed. I don't necessarily think that's true. I think that the rogue in general has a focus on melee builds, and then the barber has exacerbated that even further. But I'm curious to hear what you all have to say. I'd love to see more kind of options to play at that fully ranged position. However, Diablo 4 in general just discourages that with the suppressor affects. But, perhaps in the future we could get some sort of change to encourage different build diversity. Because, well, at the end of the day, one of the best things about this game and most fun things about this game is changing your build and trying something new. At least that's some of the most fun I have, which is why I do a lot of videos for you all in that sense. Thanks for watching, everyone. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below because I'm very curious to hear your thoughts, and I'll see you all for the next one.